It is my honor to present Chester DePratter to you all tonight. He's been recently specializing and focusing on the Spanish incursions into the United States, along with the French. And that's the subject of tonight's talk. And Santa Elena was 50 years before the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. So here we are. We are less than 10 miles as the crow flies from Santa Elena as we sit here tonight. So Chester is going to take us back there and take us through some fascinating findings that have taken place and will take place in the future.
Yes. So if you're wanted for anything, don't talk to me. I'm wired 3 different ways, so be careful what you say. It's a great pleasure for me to be here on Spring Island again. I was here several years ago, and it's always nice to come back, and it's great to see such a large audience. You never know how many people are going to show up because not everybody's interested in the 16th century. But maybe tonight I can tell you a few things that you didn't know about the very area you live in. So Santa Elena is the Spanish name for Port Royal Sound and for the Spanish settlement that ultimately was placed on Parris Island that we'll be talking about as we go through the talk tonight. The port of Santa Elena was named in the 1520s by Spanish explorers and slavers who came to this part of the coast in 1521. And then there was an attempted settlement along the South Carolina coast somewhere in 1526. But beginning in that 1520 period, and we're only talking 30 years after Columbus came to the New World, Santa Elena and Port Royal Sound by its other name was already known to every sailor, every map maker in the European world. It wasn't an unknown spot. It was well known, and it attracted a lot of the attention we're going to be talking about tonight that occurred in the 16th century in the competition between the French and the Spanish and the English for control of this part of the New World. The English, of course, won out in the end, and that's why we're speaking the English won out, and that's why we're speaking English tonight. But if history had turned just a little bit differently, we might be speaking Spanish or French. But history has its own way, and we'll talk about how it is that we ended up speaking English tonight. But I'm not talking about the entire 16th century. Tonight we're really going to focus on a 25-year period between 1562 and 1587. And so there are going to be a lot of dates because people came and went and did things. And so if you get lost with the dates, don't worry about it. It's only a 25-year period, and we're going to be going chronologically. So just the order is most important, not what happened in 1564 versus 1576. So I know we're not in school anymore and trying to remember those dates and keep them straight. It's not what we do anymore. Excuse me. I got it. So we're going to start the story, even though Port Royal Sound at the time in the early half of the 16th century was known as Santa Elena, or the port of Santa Elena, or the river of Santa Elena. It was part of a Spanish claim that dated back to the time of Columbus. So when Columbus came to the New World, he was sailing under a Spanish flag. Portugal was allied with Spain. When Columbus came, Spain claimed the entire New World, but they shared that claim with Portugal. So there was a division of the New World between Spain and Portugal, and a line was drawn along a line of longitude that ran through what's today Brazil. So east of that line belonged to Brazil, everything west of that line belonged to Spain. That's why they speak Portuguese in Brazil today. It's west of that line, east of that line. And we're in the part that was claimed by Spain, which includes almost all of South America, all of Central America, and all of North America, was a Spanish claim dating back to 1492. So that the Spanish in the early part of the 16th century, in the 1500s, sent expeditions along the coast to explore and figure out what was here, but they concentrated on the Caribbean. the Caribbean islands, ultimately Central America, the northern coast of South America. They attempted a settlement here on the South Carolina coast. The Spanish did in 1526, but it failed after only a few months. And so after that, Spanish didn't really do much in this part of the world. And the French saw an opening where, even though this was a Spanish claim dating back to the time of Columbus, the French were looking for places to settle. In the 1550s, there were Huguenot colonies from France established in Brazil as a way, because of growing conflict between Protestants and Catholics in France. Huguenots were looking, Protestants or Huguenots, were looking for a place of refuge away from the conflict, away from the religious side of things. So they attempted settlement in Brazil in the 1550s. And then by the 1560s, their attention turned to this part of the North American coast. So in 1562, a captain named Jean Ribault came to this part of the coast looking for a place where Huguenots could seek refuge, to come and establish Huguenot colonies in a new and free land, ignoring the fact that Spain already had laid claim to this land, but they hadn't settled it. So there was a distinction between claiming and settling. So Jean Ribault arrived in 1562 with 2 ships. He landed just below Jacksonville, Florida, went up in the St. Johns River, met with the Indians, put up a stone column, which we'll talk more about in a minute, and then came up to Port Royal Sound and sailed into the harbor. And he's the one that named it Port Royal. He sailed into the magnificent harbor that's out here that we now call Port Royal and proclaimed it the finest harbor in all the world, and said that all the ships then afloat could harbor in Port Royal Sound. And so even though his orders were not to establish a settlement, he took 27 volunteers, put them ashore, helped them build a fort to hold this claim for him and for French Protestants or Huguenots to come back and settle. And so he did that here in Port Royal Sound. And this is a 1560s drawing of Port Royal Sound. And here are the 2 ships of Ribault coming into Port Royal Sound. This is Hilton Head, Bay Point Island, Parris Island. This is Dawes Island. This is Beaufort River. A 1564 map that's extremely accurate. You know, you wonder how they were able to make such a bird's eye view from the deck of a ship. But they did a great job. And I put the circle here. This is where Spring Island is. So that's your proximity to the story that we're telling tonight. So Ribault left these 16 men. Ultimately, they mutinied, killed their captain, got tired of waiting for Ribault to come back because he was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and that's a whole long story we can't get into. He never returned to help to get these guys back. So they built their own boat and sailed to France. 27 men. So they were here a year, and they were able to do that. And this is what the fort looks like in one of these same series of engravings. And one of the things I did, and there's a newsletter around here with the discovery, but this is the construction of Charles Fort on a small triangular island, which is the same island as shown right here. It's got the same creek. And so I use these drawings to figure out where Charles Fort was. And we know that after hundreds of years of searching for it in the wrong places, I finally found it on Parris Island in 1996. So we now know where Charles Fort is. So it's a place where the French attempted to settle. The Spanish heard about this. And in 1564, the year after Charles Fort was abandoned, they sent a ship up from Havana to find Charles Fort, to kill off the Frenchmen or chase him away. But they had already gone, of course. They did find a French boy living among the Indians and took him prisoner and took him back to Havana and reported that Charles Fort was abandoned. But the Spanish king, Philip II, said, we can't let those dastardly French take our land. And so he immediately began planning an expedition to come and establish a settlement on Port Royal Sound, Santa Elena, as they would have called it. And to protect this territory and to keep the French from coming back. And so before the Spanish could come, another French group came and settled down here and built Fort Caroline on what's today the St. Johns River. So in 1564, 2 years after Charles Fort was established and abandoned in 63, this is in 64, 700 French Huguenots came and built a settlement at Jacksonville, or where Jacksonville is today. So the Spanish king is even more infuriated. He sends even larger force over to attack Fort Caroline and get rid of these Frenchmen. And he did. Pedro Menendez de Avilés, who was the commander of the Spanish force, who was sent to drive out the French, attacked the French ships, ultimately overtook the fort at Fort Caroline, killed most of the people who were in it. A lot of the Frenchmen escaped on 2 ships, but they were blown ashore in a storm just south of Menendez established St. Augustine as his base of operations, which is just below here, came up and attacked the fort, and then went down farther below St. Augustine, and killed around 250 Frenchmen who were shipwrecked. As he said, in part because they were Protestants and couldn't be allowed to contaminate the minds of the Indians because they were followers of the devil. So, it was part of the time. But anyway, so Pedro Menendez de Avilés, I forgot the slide. René Laudonnière was the leader of that 1564 expedition that came and built Fort Caroline on the St. Johns. And this is a drawing of Fort Caroline. And it was attacked by Pedro Menendez and overrun in very short order. In about 2 hours, even though there were hundreds of Frenchmen inside this fort, the Spanish were able to overrun the walls. Many of the people were killed, and some escaped to catch the boats that were going back to France. But very few out of the 700 that were here, plus the reinforcements that came, only about 200 out of 900 or so Frenchmen survived. So a very small number. Pedro Menendez de Avilés was who Spanish King Philip II sent to eradicate this French presence. He originally was going to establish Spanish Florida as a private venture, investing his own money in this land that became Florida. It had been called Florida actually since the time of Ponce de Leon in 1513. But he was going to make this a major part of the Spanish Empire in the New World. And as part of his reward, he was going to get his own personal estate built somewhere near where we are today, land of his choosing that was 25 leagues square, and that's about 60 miles on a side, would be his personal estate and his reward for coming and staking Spanish claim to this part of the world. So he had pretty great incentive. And Santa Elena was the place that he wanted to establish his first settlement, here on Port Royal Sound. But he was distracted by his attack on the French who were down near Jacksonville, and he established St. Augustine as a base of operations 1565 when he first arrived. And he didn't come to Port Royal Sound and Santa Elena until the next year, 1566. So in 1565, he established St. Augustine, and then in 1566, he came up and established the town of Santa Elena on Parris Island, we now know, because archaeology has been done there, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so it's about 150 miles from here at St. Augustine by water to Santa Elena, making Santa Elena a very remote outpost. In the 16th century, it's not like there was regular supply routes coming, so that the people were stuck in St. Augustine were generally in bad shape because they were a long way from Havana. People who were in Santa Elena were even farther away from the source of supplies. And in both St. Augustine and Santa Elena in the early period in the mid-1560s, very difficult conditions, poor supply, disease attacking the settlers here, not as bad as at Jamestown later, where many of the settlers died in the first year, but disease and adaptation to the heat and the mosquitoes and the humidity would have been very great. So that we have Santa Elena established in 1566, and Menendez, the founder of Spanish Florida, intended this to be his capital and his personal home, but he didn't actually move to Santa Elena and to Parris Island, where Santa Elena is, until 1571. So it took him 5 years to get here. This is where Parris Island, this is Parris Island, entrance to Port Royal Sound here, Hilton Head. It's the same map that I showed you before. This is Dawes Island. And Santa Elena is right down here on the lower tip, where they could command control of the entrance to Port Royal Sound with a fort. So there were a series of 5 Spanish forts built at Santa Elena during his 21 years of occupation. In the period that, I'll go back a bit. In the period of the early years of Santa Elena, it was occupied for 10 years, from 1566 to 1576. 1571, Pedro Menendez moved his entire family and his household and his servants, a total of 13 people, and built a house at Santa Elena. They had good relations with local Indians who traded with them and helped with supplies that were needed because of the poor supply chain. The town of Santa Elena had as many as 350 or 400 people in those years between 1566 and 1576. It was the capital of Spanish Florida, would have been known around the world as an important place. And there would have been stores and shops and schools and churches, and it was just a small town, but it was the capital of Spanish Florida. And it's right there. I don't know if I'm sure many of you are golfers. It's on the golf course on the south end of Parris Island, underneath the golf course. And we'll see some pictures of that in a minute. So the Spanish were here for 10 years, and Menendez died in 1574, only 3 years after he moved his family here. He had 2 sons-in-law. Each of them became governor of Florida, one after the other. They were poor leaders. They alienated the Indians. So in 1576, the Indians attacked Santa Elena and drove the Spanish away. Spanish left in 1576. Early in 1577, a French ship wrecked in the entrance to Port Royal Sound. The worst nightmare imaginable for Pedro Menendez, or the followers of Pedro Menendez, because they'd been trying to keep this land safe from Frenchmen, and as soon as they leave Port Royal Sound, a French ship wrecks in the harbor, and 150 Frenchmen take refuge among local Indians. So the Spanish immediately realized they had to come back and retake Santa Elena, so they constructed a prefabricated fort. So they had the carpenters in St. Augustine cut timbers to make a replica of the fort, then standing in St. Augustine, loaded it on ship, brought it to Santa Elena, and put it up in 6 days, because then they would have immediate defense against the Indians and the Frenchmen, because the Indians have driven out, and now these Frenchmen are here spreading the word of the devil. And so this is a drawing, a contemporary drawing of that 1577 fort thrown up in 6 days. And these are cannons, and this is a powder room, and there 75 or so soldiers were housed in this. The soldiers that came to live in this fort spent the next 3 years tracking down every single French survivor from the shipwreck of the ship, which was called Le Prince. A French ship called Le Prince, 150 survivors, and it took the Spanish 3 years to track them down, some of them as far away as the mountains, the Appalachians, because they'd fled trying to reach safety, but of course they never did. So they were these Frenchmen were taken to St. Augustine if they weren't killed in battle, questioned, drawn and quartered, tortured severely. A very harsh time, but that was how you dealt with Protestants at the time, I guess. So here's this fort. It was occupied during the period when the French were being hunted down. Santa Elena was reestablished, but it was never the capital after it was abandoned in 1576. In 1577, when this fort was built, it was more of a military outpost. So there were 75 or so soldiers and their families that lived here in this town during the period between 1577 and the 1580s. But then the English get involved in the story. So Sir Walter Raleigh with a charter from the Queen, was sent to establish an English colony in the North American coast. And he established the settlement at Roanoke in what's now North Carolina in 1585. So Santa Elena is still occupied as a military outpost, but now the English are up here, you know, I forget exactly how far, I've got it on the map, a couple 300 miles away along the coast, establishing a settlement at Roanoke. So now not only are they dealing with French intrusions, but the English are moving in. So Sir Walter Raleigh establishes it, what does that say, 375 miles from Santa Elena up to Roanoke. So a good distance away, but still too close for comfort. And so immediately the Spanish from St. Augustine sent expeditions up to explore the coast along where northern North Carolina coast and Chesapeake Bay, because they had to know where these English were because they were a threat. So here's a picture of Roanoke Island, and here's where the English colony was on the island of Roanoke in 1585. Then Francis Drake, another Englishman, gets involved in the story because he has a charter from the Queen of England, Elizabeth I, to attack Spanish colonies in the New World. Because they're, you know, just because Spain made a claim to this land a long time ago, it doesn't mean they have any right to hold on to it if Elizabeth wants it, apparently. And so Francis Drake gets in his ships, a large number of ships, sails across the ocean, attacks the town of Santo Domingo here on the island of Hispaniola, Cartagena on the northern coast here, and then he comes up to St. Augustine and attacks St. Augustine. So this is a contemporary drawing of Santo Domingo, which Francis Drake captured and ransomed, took a lot of slaves and material goods from there and loaded them on his ships because he's going to take them to Roanoke, ultimately, to resupply the people there. This is Cartagena on the northern coast of South America, and this is a Francis Drake period drawing from 1586 of his attack on St. Augustine. So this is the ocean, Drake's ship's down here at the bottom. Here's the fort defending the town of St. Augustine, and here's the town. And this is, like I say, it's a 1586 drawing of that settlement at St. Augustine, a very fine map. So Francis Drake attacks St. Augustine. He destroys the fort that you can see there. He burns the town. He takes all the cannon out of the fort, takes all the supplies, and he gets back on his ships and he heads north, and he's going to attack Santa Elena because it's another Spanish outpost and it's on his way north to get to Roanoke. But he was too far offshore to see the entrance to Port Royal Sound. So any of you who are sailors know that if you're coming north along the coast, Tybee Island pushes you out away from the coast because it's a big delta. And then he didn't turn sharply enough back to the west to see the entrance to Port Royal Sound, so he missed the harbor and he continued on to Roanoke, where there were still settlements. And he was going to leave all the supplies he picked up from the destruction of these 3 Spanish colonies that he'd attacked, but the people in Roanoke were all ready to go home at that point. They'd been there about a year, so they all loaded on his ships and sailed back to England with him. And then there were subsequent groups that came back and lived on Roanoke, and ultimately in 1607 Jamestown was established, and then it was there forever. After Jamestown, there was no way to root people out. So that when the Spanish were at Santa Elena, in that last period from 1577 to 1587, when Santa Elena was abandoned, only the year after Drake burned St. Augustine, the decision was made to abandon Santa Elena. Too far away to protect, not a large enough garrison there to keep somebody like Francis Drake from burning it or destroying it again. And so this is a drawing of the very last Spanish fort at Santa Elena, when the town was abandoned in 1587. So again, this is a contemporary drawing done when that fort was in existence in the 1580s. So Santa Elena was a colony. It was the capital of Spanish Florida, very important place in the world, and it's on Parris Island, right there in Port Royal Sound. People didn't know much about Parris Island having Santa Elena on it for a long time because there wasn't much translation of Spanish documents until the 1930s that related to Santa Elena. But there were documents describing Ribault being in this area, because when Ribault came in 1562 and left as colonist and went back, and I said he was in prison in the Tower of London in 1563, he wrote a book about his adventures in Florida, and it was translated into English and published in 1564. So that when colonists came to establish Carolina in 1670, the only book describing the history of this area they had was Jean Ribault's book about French being here in the 1560s. And so they knew people that came here in 1711 when Beaufort was established didn't really know about Santa Elena. But they knew there was a fort over there on Parris Island that they thought was Charles Fort. So people used to go over and dig for artifacts. In the 1700s and the 1800s and the early 1900s, it was a common place to go to Parris Island, to where the golf course is now, and dig up what they thought were French relics. In 1923, the Marine Corps Major Osterhout, went out to dig in the fort, and all the excavations that people were doing on Parris Island was in the remnant of this fort, which we now know as a Spanish fort. But the interpretation of it as a French fort was because that's the only source they had. And this Marine Corps Major in 1923 was sent out by the commanding general at Parris Island, by then it was a Marine Corps base, to prove that it was Charles Fort. And so, as it turns out, Major Osterhout was himself of Huguenot ancestry, and he went out and dug, and he didn't know the difference between French and Spanish pottery, and he probably wanted it to be Charles Fort. That's what everybody said it was. So he proclaimed it to be Charles Fort in 1923. And as a result of that, Congress in 1926 put up this nice monument in the middle of that Spanish fort saying this was Charles Fort. And the monument's still there. If you ever go to Parris Island and visit the site of Santa Elena, you can see this nice column, but it's wrong. My colleague Stanley South began doing archaeology in Santa Elena in 1979, and I joined him in 1991. So he's now deceased, unfortunately, passed away just a few years ago, but he worked there on the site from 1979 until 2007 when we last did our work. I want to run through these very quickly. This is a layout of the town, the site of Santa Elena. This is the golf course clubhouse if you've ever been there. This is the old 7th fairway, 8th fairway, 9th fairway, driving range, and the town of Santa Elena is pretty much in this area. And so there are remnants of 2 forts that you can see today. This one has a moat that's been standing open since the 16th century. And this one was found through archaeology in 1979. As it turns out, Charles Fort, which I tracked down in 1996, is underneath this Spanish fort, which is one of the first Spanish forts built at Santa Elena. It was built there. The Spanish fort was built in 1566, only 4 years after the French had built Charles Fort there. This is the moat of the Spanish fort built on top of Charles Fort. My colleague Stan South dug this in 1980. What he didn't realize was this little depression right here, this little dark ditch, that's the moat of French Charles Fort. And this Spanish fort had been dug through it. And you can see that this is the dug Spanish moat, and this is the remnant of the French moat from Charles Fort. Not nearly as impressive, and here's me down in the moat of Charles Fort. So it was a very quickly built fort for 27 men, only to hold the ground until Ribault was able to go to France and come back. So it didn't have to be a very substantial structure. Some of the more exciting things we found up here right next to the corner of the clubhouse, I was looking for a missing fort, and I did a lot of small shovel tests or small holes all back through here. There at the corner of the clubhouse, this is the shovel test. That's how close we were to the clubhouse on the golf course. And found a Spanish pottery kiln that there's no documentary record that says there was ever a pottery kiln at Santa Elena. It's very small. From here all the way to the end is only about 10.5 feet. Firebox is only about 4.5 feet square. Had a couple of arches that supported the pots. Very crude structure. But this is how it looked when it was being used, probably. And this is the array of pottery that came out of it. None of it's glazed, so many of these forms would have been glazed, so we think they were just testing the clay to see what they could make. The kiln was only fired twice, but quite an array of forms. Yeah, you can ask your question. Because of the layers of ash at the bottom of it. Well, it might have been fired more than that, but they would have had to completely clean it out. And based on other factors, we think it was only used briefly. As I mentioned, we dig those shovel tests. This is on the old driving range. During most of the years we were working there, it was an active golf course. And we had to dig in the woods away from the golf course, but this was in 1995. We had a general who was interested in what we were doing, so we were allowed to dig holes wherever we wanted, and we had to just wait for golfers to play through or for the driving range to be empty. And so here we are hurrying up to dig these holes because we dug these holes every 30 feet on a grid over an area covering about 35 acres so that we could figure out where the town of Santa Elena was. So here's the clubhouse and the kilns up here, the two forts I showed you before here. This is the distribution of Spanish pottery in those small tests. And so we counted and weighed everything, put it in the computer, and it drew us a map of the town of Santa Elena. And these different colors are densities of artifacts. So where it's really dark, there were houses and trash piles, and where it's lighter, it's where there were structures or void in the occupation. In this area here, we were lucky enough to, early on, to dig the house of the governor of Santa Elena in the second occupation, so from 1577 to 1587. And this is the governor's house. It's 22 feet square. It's not a mansion, it's not elaborate. It might have been 2 floors. We really can't tell because all we've got is post holes. But it was plastered with lime, about a 1/2 inch thick, and the roof was covered with lime because they were afraid that the Indians would come back and shoot flaming arrows into the town as they had when it was abandoned the first time. And then this is a servant's hut, we believe, with its own well and 2 outbuildings associated. We think these are the 2 lots associated with the governor in that period when the Spanish were actively hunting down those Frenchmen that came on the shipwreck Le Prince. This is what a well looks like at Santa Elena. So we found the post holes from the house, and we dig these wells, and we put in a well point system and pump the water out of the ground so we can dig it dry. So the Spanish dug a shaft about 8 or 10 feet deep, put barrel in the bottom, stacked another barrel on top of that, another barrel on top of that, and then they had a shaft to dip water out of, lined with barrels. Most of the barrels above the water table have been salvaged by either Indians or the Spanish. And this part is preserved because this was below water. So this is where the water line was in the bottom of that well. And when you dig in a well, you find all the garbage, things that were broken that were thrown in the well, either during its use or when it was abandoned. And then there's this fort. This is a fort here, is the one that was prefabricated and brought from St. Augustine. And I was looking for it all the way back in 1993 when I found the pottery kiln. I suspected it was in this area, and I dug holes back there, but I didn't actually find it. This particular fort that was prefab in 1577. Sometimes we use shovels and picks. Sometimes we use machines. We were stripping off a large area, searching for that fort. And this is what it looks like when you strip off one of those, and you can see all the disturbances created by humans all the way back to the beginning of the occupation of the site. And so these long linear dark features are agricultural ditches from the 19th century. These white squares here, 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 here are footings for tent encampment that was there in World War I, erected by the Marine Corps. Can't really see much more in this, but you can see the thickness of that soil layer right there. All of the occupation by humans on Parris Island is contained in that top 14 to 16 inches. We're right here. All this light soil is the original soil that the island's made of. And all of the occupation is in that top 16 or so inches. So what we do is we strip off that disturbed topsoil, map all these features, and then go back and try to figure out if they're Spanish or French or plantation or Indian or whatever. Incidentally, this was in the 7th fairway. So they shut the 7th fairway for 2 weeks so we could do these excavations. And unfortunately, we didn't go quite far enough. That preceding trench, the actual fort is just across that sidewalk, and we didn't get quite far enough. So I was off by 40 or 50 feet, but we ultimately found it. Through my friend Victor Thompson, who is an archaeologist at the University of Georgia, he brought over his ground-penetrating radar that we used to look for that fort. That we dug those trenches in the 7th fairway and didn't find the fort. I said, okay, we'll bring in the heavy equipment. So Victor came, and we spent just a week, and this is what the signal looks like. This is what a fort looks like through radar. There's a big oak tree right here, so this white block was what we couldn't use the radar in. But all those yellow and brown things are large post holes that are part of that Spanish fort, because the fort was built entirely of wood with posts set in the ground. And this is a reconstruction of what I think that fort looked like. Based on the archaeology, the drawing that you saw that was done at the time, and my reading of documents of what the fort probably looked like. We went back more recently. Okay, we found the fort. Now we're going to do the whole town. So the whole town, these are the 2 forts, one here, and this is the clubhouse. So using 3 different instruments, we got a good broad coverage of a good part of the town, because we wanted to know more without having to dig, because digging is very expensive. Radar radar, magnetometer, and resistivity are relatively cheap. These are the outputs from magnetometer and radar, so they're different. But you can see we identified these circular Indian structures in both. Maybe you can't see them, but those are the returns, and all of that's mapped. And so, whoops, back up. So that we're beginning to get a feel of the extent of the town of Santa Elena, where the major occupations were, some of these large features on those maps. If you go...
Is that a post hole size hole, or is that something bigger than that you've got circled there?
Those little dots are each post holes, and these are larger structures connecting those post holes that we think are Indian council houses that were seen when English settlers came, or English explorers came, Hilton and Sanford, in the 1660s. But I was going to go back real quick. Keep hitting the wrong one. Can't really see it. Maybe in this one you can see it. There are all these little dots. Those are all pits and post holes and wells that we only see as dots in this work. So we have to go back now and find a way to figure out exactly what they are. So the prospect is just starting. This is again an image of the French shipwreck, Le Prince, that I said wrecked at the entrance to the harbor in 1577. My colleague Jim Sparrick at the Institute and I have been looking for this wreck since 1998. We're 20 years in, and we haven't given up. And the way we look for that is with another instrument. This is a magnetometer. It looks for deflections in the Earth's magnetic field as it's dragged along behind a boat. And the way you search for it is you drag it along behind a boat. It's like mowing your lawn. You go up this way, you turn around and come back 20 meters over, or about 65 feet. And then you keep going back and forth, dragging this magnetometer. Everything's carefully recorded on a computer, so you know exactly where you are, where each lane took you. And this is the entrance to Port Royal Sound. This red block is the area of high likelihood. Everything in pink and orange have been searched, and so we're narrowing it down. We think we've done about 55% of the search area where the shipwreck, based on the documents that we have. And so we're looking to go back and fill in the gaps. And part of the research in both the Spanish and the French period is using original documents that describe, in the case of Le Prince, what the ship was like, where it wrecked, how it wrecked, who was on it, what the supplies were. And this is 16th century French, which any of you who took French in high school could not come close to reading a word of. I guarantee it.
Where is that document?
This one is probably in Paris, in the major archive there, and this is John DePratter, whose works on us in documents. And that's sort of the end of that story. I want to say that, I don't know if you've ever been to St. Augustine. This is the fort in St. Augustine, the Castillo de San Marcos, that was built there beginning in 1672, 2 years after Charleston was settled by the English, because the Spanish realized they needed better defense now that the English were just up the road. And so they spent almost 30 years constructing this Castillo there in St. Augustine. So if things had gone different, if Pedro Menendez hadn't died in 1574 when he was back in Spain on an expedition for the king, he might have been a powerful enough leader to hang on to this coast and hold on to it for Spain. We don't know. That's the way history works. Ultimately, they pulled back to St. Augustine, and as all of you know, St. Augustine's been continuously occupied since 1565, even though during part of that time it was controlled by the English because of a war, and Spain ceded St. Augustine and other territory to English, and then back to the Spanish, and then ultimately to the United States. So if you haven't been to St. Augustine, go there. And I would say if you want to know more about the story of Santa Elena, the Santa Elena History Center is on Bay Street downtown. There's an exhibit there, and I did the exhibit, and we're still working on expanding it, and it's an interesting place to go. And that's the end. St. Catharines Island? Yeah. So in the beginning, in the 1560s, Pedro Menendez established other outposts along the coast of what's now Georgia and South Carolina. And one of the military garrisons he put on St. Catharines Island, which is about 30, 40 miles south of Savannah on the coast. In the later 16th century, a whole series of missions were established all the way up to St. Catharines Island, starting on the northern Florida coast and along the entire Georgia coast up to St. Catharines. Those were abandoned finally in 1683. So for about 100 years, there were Spanish missions all along the northern Florida and Georgia coast, and they were abandoned, again, because of the settlement of Charleston and the beginning raids of Indians allied with Charleston and the English that were settled there. So we're not even, that's a later part of the 16th century in the mission part that we just didn't even get into. Anybody else?
So those drawings of the forts that you had show cannons, I think.
Yes.
Have you found any of those?
We have not. When the town was abandoned the first time, some cannon were left behind, but they were retrieved when the Spanish came back with a prefabricated fort. And then the cannon in the last fort were taken away because one of the reasons Santa Elena was abandoned was because Francis Drake burned the fort and town of St. Augustine and took with him all the cannon that were in St. Augustine. So St. Augustine was indefensible until they closed down Santa Elena and brought the cannon down and mounted them in a new fort. So that was a major argument for abandoning. Yeah, we find cannonballs and lots of other things, but not the cannons themselves.
Yes.
What's the basis for the claim that Santa Elena was the first permanent European settlement, if all this is coming from St. Augustine?
There is no justification for that claim. Though people make that claim all the time because everybody wants to have the first and the oldest. St. Augustine was clearly settled first. There were hundreds of people living there at the time Santa Elena was established in 1566. And when Santa Elena was first established, there was a fort there with a small garrison. And there wasn't a major population settlement there until 1569. So really the oldest settlement in South Carolina, the Spanish, was probably the Allione expedition colony from 1526 that only lasted several months or a few months, but we don't even know where it is. I've been looking for it, but haven't found it.
How did this all happen so fast?
Well, part of it was when Spanish came to the New World, they early on focused on places where there was great wealth among the Indians. So in northern South America, the Inca had, the leader of the Spanish who was there, captured Atahualpa, who was the king, and he was ransomed for a room filled with gold. And so the Indians brought, tons of gold and ransomed the chief. And same way in Central America, Nicaragua, Panama, the Indians had lots of gold. Mexico, lots of gold, silver, and it was all taken back to Spain and put in the treasury. And it was used to fund all of these activities. Ultimately, Spain went bankrupt because not only were they mounting all these expeditions, but they were fighting wars in the Netherlands and with the Turks. And, there was continuing fighting going on in Europe that they had to fund. So they went bankrupt 3 times in the late 16th century.
Two more questions.
Yeah.
I guess a pretty mundane question. How did Ribot end up in the Tower of London?
So when Ribot was here in 1562, dropped off the men who built Charles Fort, went back for reinforcements. By the time he got back, the first religious war in France between Catholics and Protestants had begun. He fought on the side of the Protestants for a while, couldn't get in to talk to anybody about resupply, so he went to England for assistance. There were bad relations with the English and some factions of the French Protestants. Ribot happened to be in the wrong faction, so he was thrown in prison and wrote his book, as I said, while he was there and had it translated. So he wasn't, in there wasting his time. He probably the first book written about explorations in this, well, certainly the first one about explorations in this part of the world. Yeah. Oh, good, thanks. It's hard to fit it in to